Why do they still wear my father's face? The man on the bus turned his head, and for a half-second that froze my blood, he had my father's tired eyes. It was the third time that week I'd seen a dead man walking among strangers, and it was only Tuesday. Grief is a quiet thief. It doesn't smash a window. It finds the key you left under the mat and lets itself in, making a home in the empty spaces. For 3 months after we buried my father, Marcus, it lived in his study. The room smelled of old paper and stale pipe tobacco, a scent that clung to the air like a ghost. I'd kept the door closed, treating it as a shrine or a tomb, I wasn't sure which. Finally, I decided the best way to evict the silence was to fill it with purpose. I would digitize his life's work, every map he'd ever drawn, every meticulous note on urban sprawl. It was a project my father, a man who believed in the elegant logic of a well-planned city, would have appreciated. The first few days were a blur of dust and categorization. Stacks of vellum, city blueprints rolled into tight scrolls, and leather-bound journals filled with his precise architectural script. I found a map of our own city, one I'd never seen before, tucked inside a folio on civic engineering. It was unlike his other work. His usual clean lines were disrupted by frantic, handwritten annotations in the margins, circling certain intersections and obscure alleyways with phrases that made no sense. Pattern echo, frequency high, thin spot. I traced a red circle he'd drawn around a bus stop on 8th Avenue, a place I passed every day. For a man who dedicated his life to imposing order onto chaos, the notes felt like a fever dream. I folded it away, a strange and unsettling aberration I attributed to the stress of his last few years. That evening, the ache in my back was a dull throb that matched the one in my chest. On the bus home, the city lights smeared past the window in wet streaks of neon and white. I was tired, my mind numb from hours of scanning documents. A man sitting a few rows ahead shifted, turning to look out the window, and my breath caught in my throat. The late-day light carved out his profile, the distinct slope of his nose, the familiar way his shoulders stooped with a quiet weariness. It was my father's silhouette, a perfect, impossible replica. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Then he turned his head forward again, and the illusion shattered. He was just a stranger, balding and younger than Dad had been. I exhaled, the air leaving my lungs in a shaky rush, and pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. Grief, I told myself. Exhaustion. It plays tricks on the eyes. A few days later, I was half listening to the local news while making dinner. A reporter was standing in front of City Hall talking about zoning permits. It was the usual monotonous broadcast, background noise to the sound of a sizzling pan. He turned to the camera for his closing remarks, and I saw them. Not eyes like my father's, but my father's eyes. The same shade of weary blue. The same intricate web of lines at the corners that spoke of too many years spent squinting at blueprints. The camera held on him for a second, maybe 2, and in that sliver of time, his gaze felt like it was locked directly on me. Then the broadcast cut to a commercial for a local car dealership. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the spatula I was holding suspended over the stove. The face belonged to a man named David Chen, according to the graphic on the screen. But the eyes had been my father's. It was another momentary glitch, another unprovable flicker in my perception. But the rationalizations were starting to feel thin, like a worn blanket that offers no warmth against a creeping chill. The sightings were no longer flickers. They had become a persistent static, an error in the code of my reality. A week after the news reporter, I saw him in my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, as he took out his recycling bin. The face that turned toward me wasn't one of polite greeting, but of cold, silent accusation. My father's face, etched with a disapproval that made my stomach clench. I stumbled back inside, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a gasp. It was the same when a courier delivered a package. The young man's face momentarily dissolved into my father's, the expression one of profound disappointment before it solidified back into a polite smile. They were always looking right at me, seeing through me. They knew. My phone became my only hope for an anchor, a witness to my fraying sanity. The next time it happened, at a crosswalk, I was ready. A woman waiting for the light to change looked at me, and there he was, his face superimposed over hers, his eyes hollow with a sorrow that wasn't his own. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. I raised it, tapped the screen, and the shutter clicked. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. Proof. I had proof. I hurried away from the corner, not daring to look back, and ducked into the alcove of a closed shop. My heart hammered as I opened the photo gallery. The image loaded. It showed a perfectly ordinary woman, mid-30s, with brown hair and a slightly annoyed expression, staring directly at my camera. My father was gone. There was no trace he had ever been there. My world began to shrink. The city, once a place of comforting anonymity, felt like a crowded stage where every actor wore a mask of my father's face, waiting for me. I started having groceries delivered, leaving instructions to leave them at the door. I worked from home, losing myself in the sterile logic of digital archives, but the silence of the apartment was a breeding ground for fear. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself back in his study, the air thick with his absence. I pulled out the strange annotated map. The phrases scrawled in the margins, pattern echo, frequency high, thin spot, no longer seemed like the ramblings of a tired mind. I traced the red circles with a trembling finger. The bus stop on 8th Avenue, the intersection by City Hall where the reporter had stood, the route the courier would have taken. He knew. He hadn't been mapping sewer lines or traffic flow. He was mapping these occurrences. He had been seeing them too. The thought offered no comfort, only a deeper, more terrifying layer to the dread. This wasn't just my grief. This was an inheritance. I spent hours staring at the map, my father's last desperate testament. Later, long after the moon had risen, I stood in the living room, the city a distant, glittering web outside the window. In the dark glass, I saw my reflection, a pale, haunted shape. I watched as my own face seemed to shimmer, the lines blurring at the edges. My jawline hardened, my eyes receded into tired, shadowed hollows, and the skin tightened over my cheekbones. The face looking back at me was no longer my own.
It was Marcus Vance's, not worn by a stranger, but emerging from beneath my own skin. And its expression was one of absolute, soul-crushing despair. Sometimes the deepest horror isn't found in the shadows, but in the harsh light of a reflection you no longer recognize. Grief has a way of remaking the world in its own image, blurring the lines until you can't be sure where the sorrow ends and you begin. That first glimpse of a dead man walking among strangers on a bus was never the real threat. The true terror was realizing the stranger might be the one looking back from the mirror. It's a chilling reminder of how fragile our own perception can be, and we appreciate you exploring that feeling with us here on Content Channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe what Alara experienced was a haunting manifestation of her grief? Or was she truly seeing the strange patterns her father had mapped out?
Thank you for listening. Join us again when a sound engineer working late begins to notice that the empty office building has a voice of its own.